The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hiya and welcome to a webinar, Risky Time for Muslim Families Professionalised Counter Radicalisation Networks. We're here with one of the authors, Tony Stanley, and he's going to talk through his presentation. If you want to ask a question, click the question section, and if you're on the app, click the hand and it should say hand raised, and we will address all questions at the end of the session. We will unmute your audio and you'll be able to ask your question. And if you're on a computer, please click the hand under attendees by your name and it will go orange. If you don't want to speak, you can just type out a question in the question section if desired.
Right, thanks, Kerry, and it's good to be here. Delighted that BASW invited me to come along and talk about this topic. I think that this is a really important area for social work and much more debates needed. I'll introduce myself on behalf of my colleagues, and I'm Tony Stanley, the Chief Social Worker for Birmingham. I'm also the Chair of the West Midlands Teaching Partnership, where we're doing some more work in this topic. And my colleagues that helped write the paper in the debate are Surinder Guru from Birmingham University and Vicky Kopak from Edge Hill in Liverpool. But can folks introduce themselves here so we can figure out who we are in the room, and that will be helpful in terms of how we'll do the session, which I hope is more interactive than me just talking away.
Yeah, my name's Michelle, and I run an organisation called Ethan's Education.
Great.
I'm interested in community work.
Thanks, Michelle.
I'm Shahid Makvi. I'm the editor of Professional Social Work magazine.
I'm Annette Callier. I'm a social worker with Dudley. Interim social worker.
Great, thanks, Annette. And we've got some people online who are presumably listening in. I'm never quite sure how technology works with these things. Okay, so I've been interested in these issues for quite a while now as a social worker and as a lead social worker for Birmingham. And we could be talking about all sorts of issues for family life in contemporary England at this time, I think. And the fact that we're going to focus on terrorism and radicalisation, I don't want us to get too caught up in the fact that that's the illustration, because I think what I'm going to talk about, I hope what I'm going to talk about, is one of the crises that social work's facing at the moment, which in the last few years has led us through a range of influences, led us to a point, I think, that social work is overly focused on the child as a neoliberalist idea, that child is the sole focus, and that the family system and the community and the society around us and a globalized world is somehow just off our radar, and we're invited not to have it as part of our radar. So it's nice to have community representatives in the room and social work colleagues. And what I'd like is for you to chip in. Don't sit there and just listen to the world of what I think going on. If you've got questions or issues you want to raise, do that, because hopefully this is going to be interesting for you as well as for the people participating. So a bit about me. As the Chief Social Worker for Birmingham, I've got responsibility for professional practice. I have responsibilities for quality assurance, for making sure the learning team are responding to that analysis. And I brief every 3 months the senior team and elected members on the quality of social work and how we know that. So it's very qualitative in terms of analysis, as well as metric in terms of the numbers, and positioning that in terms of an improving journey, although there's always much to do in these organisations. So the paper came out just a while ago in a special edition looking at risk and decision making, and we've been invited to contribute this to a book coming up. So it's quite exciting that this is getting some publicity and some interest. And again, thanks to BASW for inviting me and having this session on. So look, let's just start then with I'll probably get the technology wrong. All right, so this image, I use that quite often, and Vicky uses this in her work, in terms of not being unnecessarily provocative, but just reminding us that in our work, we are thinking about children. We're thinking about children and their context, children and their lives. And while this image is fairly confrontational, we still have to hold in mind from a social work perspective that what we're holding in mind is that this child has a set of rights, but the rights for this child are not in isolation to the child alone. The child is connected, the child belongs, the child's part of family and community. And we think that's an important message when we're talking about how we as social workers respond to quite evocative ideas like radicalization and terrorism. I think it's quite easy for us to pause and form a judgment, form a narrative, have a story about what we think is going on here. But in social work terms, what I think we need to focus on is to stop and remind ourselves that this is a child, and therefore the site of our thinking, but not in and on the child as alone. And here this image highlights that more in a more nuanced way, I think. We have a child connected, physically, emotively, materially connected to adults, but positioned by the adults in a way of high vulnerability. We would say this is absolutely not okay for children in this experience. And the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child talks about children have rights to be free of harm and abuse. But that convention, I think, also reminds us as social workers that children have rights to be part of family life. And how do we as social workers determine this awfully complex domain? We would say on the surface of things, this is not okay for this child to be here. But then as a social worker, do we think about removing that child from that context? And if so, where do we place the child? What are the risks associated with children when they are removed from family home? And again, this might be issues around any illustration in social work. While we're talking about radicalisation and terrorism, I guess it's important to start off by saying, as a social worker, I want the social work values of why a child has rights with a family system to drive some of my thinking, so that when I'm responding to these images, hopefully my social work is coming to the fore. I've already done this in my, haven't I? No? Technology, right, okay. Okay, so again, I think we share a goal in social work with society, with politics, with international conventions, in that we do want to be part of a movement around improving community safety. I think social workers have an incredibly important role in being a part of understanding community and putting forward suggestions and analysis through our practice to do that. That prevention is important and intelligence is important. And I think that we do our work with many partner agencies and family members and community groups. But in this particular set of issues, what we're arguing in the paper is that, are we over professionalizing this response? Where is the family? Where is the community? And is our work and our practices of work leading us down a more narrowing pathway where it's the professionalization of risk that becomes the dominant narrative? The concerns are professionally orientated. And does that then mean that family perspectives, child perspectives, community perspectives are almost rendered out of the conversation? In social work, we know this, that the political and social lives we work with are really messy and uncertain. But too often, we argue, social work is locating the problem within the person. And that means, I think, as I said earlier, an over-focus on the child as in need of rescue from that situation versus the need of a child's rights to be encouraged and promoted and supported as part of their own system. And radicalisation, and Vicky's done a lot of work in this area, radicalisation is often promoted and seen through the prism of the psi complex, psychology, psychiatry, psychotherapy. Again, what that does, we argue, is render the social context within which people's lives matter absent and silent. And in social work terms, we're encouraged to look at this through a psychological, a psychiatric prism, and that reinforces problems. And the system drives forward solutions to problems. And ultimately, I think children can be easily removed from family systems. So what we're saying in this paper is, what are the narratives that get rendered in or out of this area of work? And are young people's agency, their political activity, is that something we can work with proactively? Or is it more problematic now that the prevent duty's here? And I'll talk a bit about the prevent duty in a few minutes to explain how that sets up a particular framework for us in social work that we must respond to. But the questions we're raising here are generalized around social work. Do we hold in mind young people's risk-taking behavior? How do our social work processes and agencies hold in mind uncertainty about behavior and action? How comfortable are we with risk-taking? And so on and so forth. And what can we learn about that when we bring that in to our work? Do ask anything at the moment if you've got anything burning. How will we know if people online are asking anything? You'll just, they'll flag. All right, okay. Okay, so this is a well-used quote from Boris Johnson, and I think preempts the prevent duty, which in the paper we talk about the duty arriving, and I argue in a number of other papers with Surinder that actually the prevent duty came for social work without any fanfare and debate and dispute, and now I think we're playing catch-up. But this is what Boris said in 2014, Mayor of London at the time. He was making a political point about this. At present, he says, there's a reluctance by the social services to intervene, even when they and the police have clear evidence of what's going on, because it's not clear that the safeguarding law, presumably he means the Children's Act, would support such action. A child may be taken into care, he argues, if he or she is being exposed to pornography or being abused, but not if the child is being habituated into this utterly bleak and nihilistic view of the world that could lead them to become murderers. And what Boris really is flagging here, I think, is how do we understand and therefore make sense of and make decisions about children in potential harm's way? In this illustration, he's indicating the likelihood that someone may go on and commit something heinous, like an act of terrorism or murder. But doesn't this position social work in a very curious way? Can I know about what's likely to happen later on? This is about pre-crime. This is about positioning social work in a situation of inviting us to respond before something's happened. Now, with children being exposed to pornography, with children being exposed to heinous beheading videos, and I've worked on cases where children have seen and been exposed to such horrific things. Now, that's absolutely emotionally harmful, and the state should act. But they are, in my view, a very small number of cases. What Boris is indicating, I think, is young people interested in exploring, being exposed, looking at sets of issues going on overseas, and their ability to have a political view, their ability to have a socio-cultural view. In this way of thinking, we are encouraged to not accept, allow, or promote that. Rather, conversely, that the social workers and the state, therefore, should step in and challenge. Now, following this, of course, the prevent duty arise. And in the paper, we talk about the backdrop of that duty, and I won't labour that too much here. But in a nutshell, July 1, 2015, a statutory duty emerged for people working with children, social workers, nurses, teachers, and so forth, now have a duty to pay due regard to offsetting terrorism. Now, that duty sums up, I guess, what I was saying earlier, in that it now positions social workers as having to do something. Of course you can.
Just before we move on to that, just going back a bit.
Yeah.
I think when you said about, one of the problems is that social workers have been expected to be pre-crime. That, for me, goes to the very nub of the majority of criticism of social work, that there is an expectation, and this is sort of, if you like, unscientific, but probably 95% of our work is to do with supporting families, shoring up families, facilitating families to make better choices. A small proportion is about where people actually commission to harm their children.
Yes, I agree with that.
So we ask social workers to flip between the two, if you like, thinking.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. But I think with this particular duty, the way it's written, we are expected to pay active attention to the possibility of terrorism emerging. And what that does, I think, is in the context of what I'm outlining with how social work's become very narrow, I think it might invite us to be overly paying attention to some people and not to others. And are we therefore paying attention to certain groups of family life? But when we're talking about a pre-crime, there are situations in this country where children have been removed on very, very spurious evidence, in my view. And are we in a position to hold children in risky situations with this illustration? Or has it shifted our practice? Is it encouraging our practice to even be more interventionist? Because this issue, in the very rare occasion it occurs, terrorism is real. It harms and hurts people, it kills people, it is materially and emotively, physically real. So it just, for me, it requires us, I think, to look at what social work therefore does and how it responds in this issue. You are right about our work offsetting potential, but I think in the far majority of cases, it's not in the criminal area. It's in the non-criminal area.
But it's that sort of conditioning of how we are viewed as a profession as well, that, without being too simplistic, a parent may harm, murder one child,
Yes.
two children within the family, and then the risk from sort of potential terrorists is that it will harm more. So we're almost being driven into this highly politicised, way of working, really.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And something we argue in the paper is that it's up to us as social workers to understand that if we're going to come up with ways to work effectively within it. Because on the one hand, the duty is very clear. We can't not deliver on it. But I think that there's a role for the police and security services that's very, very clear in my view about what I expect them to do in civil society. And I think social work has been less clear, and therefore we're likely to be steered and influenced, which is, I guess, what you're saying. And then what we do about that requires us to take a lead role. Again,
you could say that about social work across a range of areas.
Yes.
Though. I think that's something that we've got to tackle as a profession, is making sure that our role in a multi-agency context is always very clear. And I think particularly because we do work in such a multi-agency way, and we do work across contexts, I think we very quickly our roles become blurred a lot more quickly than, say, teachers or police officers.
Yes, I think you're right. I've worked in 4 countries in statutory child protection: the States, Australia, New Zealand, and here. And this would be the context that is the most challenging for social workers to articulate what social work is. And that's why I think BASW are incredibly important to make sure that we link in with what is the difference a social worker holds and therefore models that is not a police officer, a teacher, a family member. I mean, it's our code of conduct, it's our values, it's our ethics, it's rights and justice. And I think this issue has really, for me, and we argue in the paper, it really sharpens my attention to the fact that justice and rights are just so far from our day-to-day frontline practice. And I would love social workers to really think about that, so when they marshal arguments about what they do, they're marshalling it through a rights-based lens. And there's no debate in my mind about there are some situations where children must not be in that family of origin and must be somewhere, even in an interim way, until we can assure and build more safety. But I think that if we had more debate about that, I think our decision-making and therefore our position at interagency tables would be less malleable and less pushed around. And I think we're not confident enough about that. Because I don't think it's about confidence, I think it's about we don't understand it well enough to therefore apply it.
It goes back to the root of our profession, though, isn't it? We are, as a profession, we straddle both an advocacy role, but also as an agent of the state. So we hold power, but we're also then expected to advocate against a system with which we work within.
Yes, we absolutely are. But understanding that theoretically and intellectually as well as morally is our task. Because if we just approach it and say, I'm just delivering my job, then under the prevent duty, I'm going to pay particular attention to certain groups of people, in this case, Muslim families, and I'm more likely to possibly bring in stereotype and bias to that. And I'm not going to think about the ability for creating a wider family structure around that child and so forth. And so the neoliberalist influence is just going to help shape my thinking down. And I think judgments could be harming families, is what we argue in the paper. And how do we guard against that as social workers? How do we, as a profession, stand up and say, we understand the need to have guidance in this country. I came back from Berlin recently, where the German government are looking at England in terms of its policy around prevent. There's well regard for this in the European context. But on a day-to-day practice level, we lack a lot of research and debate about what this means for both practitioners and families. And I think this slide for me just sums up what we hope to be doing in terms of practice, in terms of trusting our professional colleagues, trusting our families, believing in the rights of children to be safe in harm and working to produce that. And we get sidetracked, I think, by this notion of fear and anxiety. And again, how do I make a judgment in a pre-criminal space, which is what the prevent duty sets out? This is before a crime has been committed. But as a social worker, I'm expected to understand that and make a judgment. And that, I think, is going to steer us off, because the likelihood, and it's rare, of a terrorist event is so grave. And as people, and as citizens, I talked to a social worker recently who had a relative at the concert in Manchester. And I said to her, you must not have one of these cases allocated. We must care for you as a person, as a relative, because you will have a response to this issue. And that's the stuff I think we just as social workers, as organisations, I think we need to do more investment in talking and sharing that. So,
I mean, I think in terms of one of the things that I thought about when I was reading this article and the fear-based culture. So, for instance, the Parsons Green tube bomber, one of the things that came out in the media that his foster carers and his foster placement were in the Daily Mail, and I suppose when you've got that sort of highly emotive and politicised context as well, I think that would make that would affect workers.
Yes, no, I do agree. We just need to continue to be relentless around excellent supervision that's challenging and reflective and engaging, not just have you done. Because we are people. I was in London, the Tower of London, the night that the Borough Market attack happened. I was heading off with dinner. We could have easily gone across the river that night. So it's affected. It's real for us here in this context at this time. But then what do we need as social workers to make sure we're delivering on the values and ethics of our profession? How do I not slip into a securitized notion of social work? How do I guard against that? But still make sure I'm doing my job, which at times means that there will be children and young people that I think actually mustn't be in that situation. So I just think it's quite complex. I mean, if you look at this slide, I just think it sets out, and in the paper we talk about the backdrop of our work. We've had this hardening of rules and procedures, and we've had ICS promising to sort the world out, and of course it didn't. And scandal politics, whenever there's a very sad situation, you're right, Kerry, the media, the politics around this, both at a high political level and a local political level, affect day-to-day cultures of organisations. And yet we've had this reform agenda, haven't we? At the same time, we've had this high growing notion of increased views and media coverage about social work and scandals. But then we've had this growing debate about how do we continue to reform. And you could argue, where is the evidence of ongoing reform with all the investment we've had? There's been some really good stuff, but cumulatively as a social work system, are we much better off because of all that investment these days? So I think it's a challenging backdrop. And I love the way Bridge Featherstone and others just say we've got to stop feeding this risk monster. We've got to find ways to bring the social back into social work. And again, in the paper we talk about if I just go off and do my work and assess a family and intervene at that level, in this particular backdrop, I may well be encouraged through a range of influences to overly focus on particular children. Then I am going to feed the risk monster because I'm focusing on the risks that could happen to that child. I'm unlikely to think about the possibility of this family doing something different. It's a bit like working with sexual abuse. When someone's sexually abusing children in a family, when are they not sexually abusing? What are they doing? What's in their world? What makes them think? How do they have relationships that are better and safe? What are the ways we can think about practice that invites us to stay with harm and abuse, but open up our thinking and our practice?
I thought that reform agenda feeds the risk monster because it's this constant discourse that our profession isn't good enough, that our profession needs improving, that we are inadequate, that we're unable. And I think then you create a generation of social workers who feel that they need to prove themselves constantly, and that drives risk-averse practice. Yes,
that's a good point. That's a good point.
And I'm not sure actually that is a global perspective. I think that's very much UK centric, isn't it? That we've got this really discourteous lack of respect for social work as a profession that's then whipped up in all of those sort of scandal politics.
So then it comes back to the confidence issue. Then when police come in and say this terrible thing's going to happen, and we have to, then we don't have the confidence to say this is our role, because we're working in this sort of discourse of where we're being constantly told we're inadequate. We defer. We don't.
You have the competence, but you don't have the confidence.
Yeah.
I think as well it's the whole organisation, isn't it? Because you can have your frontline social worker having the confidence, but if your organisation is trying to get out of an inadequate judgment or has got an Ofsted looming, the people at the very top of the organisation really want to succeed as well. So they're being judged by a set of mechanisms, a set of measures.
And I think the conversation we're having could be applied across social work.
Yes, yeah. I think so. I made that point at the beginning of this conversation. We're talking about radicalisation risk and terrorism, but I think we're talking more broadly about the state of social work in England at this time, which I'm quite worried about, because I think that we talk about social work organisations, yet how many of those organisations have the International Federation of Social Work definition clear? How many have justice and rights at the cornerstone of the practice frameworks? In the West Midlands, there are 33 practice frameworks for children's social care. Now, that's incredibly over-focused on a framework that I think, how do we validate and quality assure that? We don't need 33 frameworks. I mean, if you're sitting in a heart surgeon's office, there are so many ways you can cut open an aorta. I don't know why social work buys into this idea that we can do all sorts of things, and yet we do need to have some parameters. We do need to have some methods and some theories that are validated through research. And I think there's a real risk that we are going to keep feeding the machine to get ourselves out of these situations. And yet if leaders actually grab the idea that a professional leadership model means that our social workers are leading their profession, students are leading their study, managers are leading professional debates about practice, senior leaders are asking questions about the quality of social work practice, that would reinforce something quite different than our current system, I think, which reinforces the social worker does something and the rest of the organisation can do a range of other activities. And it's also incredibly expensive, the bill for child and family welfare in this country. Oh, gosh, you'll have to help me out with all of this technology.
Okay, do you want me to read it?
No, so I can see it.
The
question is, do we differentiate regarding age of the child, young people experimenting their politics different for a 5-year-old? Well, I mean, I guess it's a question for the room, really. I mean, I think, of course we do. Of course we must differentiate the capacity for children and young people to have growing autonomy and growing political views. But the question in my head is, how comfortable are we when a young person wants to express a view about what's going on in Syria, Palestine, Iraq, Iran? How comfortable are we with young people exploring that in a classroom? Again, the prevent duty implores the teacher to pay attention to that. So then is our culture opening up, or are we potentially closing down? And so, yes, a 3-year-old expressing views about the Middle East, I'd be very concerned about that if they were expressing some pro-Daesh or pro...
Touched on a point there. My friend has a son who's 14 years old, and they had a project at school initiated by the teacher in regards to religion and Muslims and so on. And he went away, he did his own internet research, which was probably of poor quality. And fed that back to the class, and it came across in a way where he was accusing Allah of this and that, of being a paedophile actually. And what actually happened after that class, maybe it's a part of this prevent duty. I'm not a social worker, so I'm not sure how it works in practice. But the police came round to my friend's house to talk to her and her son about whether he was a potential terrorist. And that was all off the back of a simple discussion that the teacher should have been able to handle in the classroom. So she should have steered that about in terms of quality of research and validity and reliability. But instead, the police went round to his house. It made me question, is that because he's a young black boy and the terrorist attacks that have happened have been by black men previously in some cases? So I think one of the things, we've talked about a lot of issues, but for me, one of the things that we need to look at is what makes a terrorist. Why do they become terrorists? And we need to take a step back. And in regards to your role as social workers, I'm not a social worker, and I would like to see social work being more proactive and more around planning, so that we could assess people's values in the home and how parents think, and teach parents how to parent with decent ethics, decent morals, and decent values that we hold throughout, Britain, so that we can say this is the way we think collectively. And then if people step outside of that, then we can question it. Whereas if we don't currently do it in that way, and we don't take baby steps in regards to how people think and the psychology of this, then we're in danger of just stereotyping people, and accusing people
But isn't
of things
there-
that they're not actually going to do. My friend's son is definitely not going to be a terrorist.
I hear what you're saying. It's an interesting illustration. But I have a different view. I think the role of social work in this context of statutory social work is residual. I don't think social work has a place in family life unless there's a compelling reason why we should knock on a door. If you're a child under 5 in England, you have a 1 in 5 chances of the state knocking on your door. In Birmingham, it's 1 in 3. Andy Bilson's research. So I think we are knocking on lots of doors. We're interrupting lots of family life. And I'm not sure that, A, that's ethical or required. And I think we live at a time when we are so overly focused on children and their ongoing safety. And I think in this country, and this is a bit controversial, but I think schools are also expected to do everything for a child. And what we don't hear in the media is, where is the family? Where are the parents? Where are the extended family in the role of this child in terms of their moral, intellectual development? So I think it's a complicated landscape we're in. But
sorry, just to interject, I disagree with what you say, because I'm looking from a community and social perspective. And it may not be the role of social workers because you have cases and lots of work to do already. But I do think there is a role or some sort of job in society to help parents parent. And the image that you showed earlier of the young boy with the gun is no different to my friend's son, who I saw sat on his dad's lap watching an 18+ violent movie. There's no reason why that child may not grow up to then become a terrorist and be into holding guns and that sort of thing. So, it's not all about religion, and it's not all about whether the Muslims are terrorists and so on, because what I see is just you see bad parenting, and bad parenting can come from all angles.
But that's,
if we looked at that in more detail.
Yes, but again, who's
yeah.
But who? Well, I think that's an interesting idea. But who's defining good and bad parenting? And isn't it rather simplistic that the role of the state? Well, I don't know that I want the state to do that so explicitly that therefore we drive. But the critique and the prevent agenda, some writers argue that the promotion of British values, an espoused, agreed set of British values, is also counterproductive for this agenda, because actually whose values are the ones hold? As a New Zealander from a long background of extended family, am I, as a British citizen recently, am I British enough to have British values? I mean, how do we define all that? If I just go around providing my definition of that to families, I think there's a risk that we may disengage more communities.
That's why I said you gather that information collectively.
Yeah.
Consultations and so on. All of this could be done. I think there is a need to have a moral framework for people to work to. I really do, in lots of areas.
Yeah, I just think in a very pluralist, multicultural society, though, we need to take care that we don't prescribe certain views that then close down and create perverse outcomes. People may decide to do something privately backstage. How do we include people and therefore accommodate a range of different views? In this particular agenda, what we're worried about in the paper is that potentially social work's caught up in a perverse outcome, which is closing things down. And what we offer in the paper are some ways to practice in this issue that actually opens it up.
So that's right, to widen the debate.
Yeah,
to allow some creativity for yourselves. And in regards to preventing terrorism, one thing I noticed when I worked with young people in the community was one of the reasons perhaps why people become radicalised is because we don't discuss firstly that people are marginalised and isolated. And if we discuss those things as well, then you'd be able to prevent a lot of the problems that we have as a part of your prevention.
But do you think radical is the right word? When did radical become bad? Radical social work.
Let's use it in the context of radicalised, in terms of I would go and pick up a gun to kill people or plant a bomb to murder people. So I'm talking about it in the context of danger and violence. And threat to society.
But I would call that violent extremism, and I think it's really clear in some European systems that they differentiate between extremism and violent extremism. Under the prevent duty in the counter-terrorism legislation in Britain, it's collapsed. So it becomes much more complicated. I think what would be very helpful is a much clearer definition about what might be extreme thinking, extreme thoughts, extreme views, radical views. And where that then turns into radical violent behaviour, the violence is a crime. And I think that would help differentiate, because at the moment, social workers are having to negotiate what constitutes potential likely harm for a child. And I know your point before is this is always a good part of our business, but with this particular illustration, it comes to the fore that we are overly, social workers aren't confident about how to do it. And again, in the paper, we offer some practical ways to address that. And another paper, which I can send to Kerry, that can go out, is a more up-to-date paper on some of the direct practice implications and how we do it. But I just think it requires us to have these sorts of debates.
I think it's
a really interesting division that you've highlighted there, because that sort of extremism in views and thinking is not uncommon for teenagers. You know, as they sort of bat around and work through what they believe on a particular subject.
I remember loads of kids in my youth really into Marxism.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. You know, so you know, we need to have a safe space for young people to work that through and not be labelled.
Talk openly, talk about their thoughts and feelings, because it creates their identity.
There's some brilliant work going on in Birmingham by a colleague of mine, Razia Butt, and colleagues who are using the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child to work with many schools in Birmingham around the rights of children to have spaces to freely share their ideas, the right to have a view, the right to have religion, and the right to have ability to congregate. And it's been a really good project because it takes it away from, are we right about these kids in terms of what they might say and focus on, to building up capacity within schools to really invite people to share ideas in a safer way. But here's another thing to think about. When children are reported to children's services, and they are around the country, and we open a file that says this child's at a risk of radicalisation, what are the implications for 5 and 10 years' time? What we don't say is that risk of becoming a Marxist or an ultra-feminist or an anti-nuclear or anti-vivisection. We don't record extreme views in children thus far. But in this illustration, we are. The potential to become and do something violently, an atrocity, is something we're paying attention to, quite rightly, in my view. But how do we get the practice and the ethics here aligned so that as we record risk of harm or potential risk of harm, that actually this doesn't travel with the child as they grow, that they're somehow labelled unduly around that. And the other thing I'll just say, sorry, Kira, is as someone who's debating these ideas, am I at risk of being seen in somehow a sympathetic view to these debates? You know, there's not a lot of social work academics, as Joe and colleagues in East London are doing some work on this. How do we present these debates that are helpful in thinking and not position myself in terms of some, I don't know?
I agree. It's very difficult to put your personal views across in your professional capacity. I mean, my background is human resource management, and it is very difficult to talk about your own values and ethics because you do bring them into the workplace. And I think the way that I would look at this is, let's look at it in a positive light. So say, for instance, I became a social activist, I would say. I was a social activist. And why did my views become more radical but non-violent? We'll define it in those two terms that we spoke about earlier. Well, they became more radical because of the experiences that I experienced. So, for example, my partner was out of work, just a different one, for 5 years and unemployed. So I witnessed discrimination, marginalisation, and isolation. This then prompted me to take action. So my experience shapes what action I will take later. In my early 20s, I wouldn't have labelled myself as a social activist. However, I didn't understand the political environment that I was operating in. I didn't understand the social environment I was operating in. So earlier you mentioned, can we sort of predict whether people are going to become Marxists and so on and so on? The answer is no, we can't. It'll be based on their experiences as individuals, how these people turn out. Society treats people in a certain way and people will react in a certain way. I think we must be more confident in that every action has a reaction.
But at the same time, and I think it's right that I want to live in a society, or I get on the subway in London or a bus in Birmingham, it's right that we have a really well-developed way of offsetting and intervening when events are about to happen. And police colleagues and security colleagues do a great job and offset a lot of this behaviour that we don't hear about.
Yeah.
But in social work right now, I just want us to think more about, are we able to articulate our role that's different to policing and security, health and education? And the collapsing of us all in terms of the prevent duty hasn't invited us to open this up. And that's what I think is important about this. And in the paper we talk about this in terms of social work has a unique role. And as Kerry rightly said earlier, we have a role around advocacy and political conversation and challenge to our practice if we are going to be encouraged to be narrow and thinking about the psychology of radicalisation. We need to also think about the political landscape, that Britain is in a situation of war and that some people have views about that. But I do think that teasing out notions of radical extremist ideas with radical violent extremist behaviours is a really helpful distinction. And I don't think in social work we have enough of that clarity, because we are also agents of the state. I'm employed by the state, many of us are employed by the state, I'm expected to carry out on behalf of the state. So I've got to deliver on the duty as well as try and interrogate what the implications are for the rights of citizens who may be unfortunately caught up in that.
And again, a removal away from violent extremism, but so the term in our role as social workers, I think it has been focused on more in terms of, you know, child-centered practice, child poverty, and we don't focus on family and community. I think and this is not, and talking just in this area, this is across lots of areas. I think in terms of it's acceptable for us to go in and put money into protecting children's services, but it seems it's sort of, there's less, but you know, there's the whole saints and scroungers and actually putting money into structural issues and early prevention and community. Those sort of resources are getting really stripped back in austerity, and I think that's having, and then social workers are expected to plug the gap. So where you haven't got those early interventions across a range of areas, so, you know, drug and alcohol services, you know, early years intervention, where you don't have that support, social workers later on in the child's journey are expected to, I think, or have to work harder to overcompensate for those issues. Is that making sense?
It does. I think again, it's a good thing for this debate today, because if we're to really deliver on social work's agenda, which is in terms of rights of citizens and families and communities and justice, to make sure that we are pointing out these ongoing gaps, how do we do that in a way that's really helpful? How do we do that through a way that's cumulative analysis about the gaps in our society? I think the austerity agenda is really interesting because on the one hand, I think there's enough money for children's services in this country. I think there are lots of money spent. It's about £9 billion a year for children's services throughout England. That's a huge amount of money. I think we're using it in very, very, sometimes very odd ways.
And it's the cost of child poverty as well.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right.
So it's the ongoing costs that these issues have. And the reason why I bring this up is because one of the issues, and I think someone at King's College was talking about the push and pull of what's driving, and it's the same with child sexual exploitation, it's the same with gangs, what's pushing these young people and pulling these young people into, you know, gangs, into child sexual exploitation, into violent extremism. And I think we do need to focus more on those push and pull factors as a state, as a community. And I think it's too, and I think even if and whatever social workers' role is, and I'm not going to pretend that I know, but whatever social workers' role is, we would set social workers up to fail in that context if the structure around them doesn't support them in that role.
Yes, yeah. It's a really good point. Again, this issue encouraging a particular way of thinking about how come someone becomes radicalised and therefore is at risk. What we argue in the paper is that at the same time that we're focused on children being at risk, by the same token, the family is seen to be a site of risky action or risky influence. So we've got a double-edged sword where the child is located in a risk discourse at the same time that the family can too easily be seen as part of the problem. And in terms of our work of opening that up, again, our practitioners encouraged to perhaps see the family in those terms and therefore dismiss the potential for family and community to play a part in intervention, which relies on the state to do it. In England at the moment, it has never been so rare to die at the hands of your family or parent or carer, and yet we've never had so many more children in care. So the children in care numbers are rising, and yet the reality of a tragedy at the hands of your parent and caregiver has never been so rare.
And what I thought was interesting in your paper was you talked about Mr. Malik, and you said that he was working with your service under Section 17, which is an agreement. So it's a voluntary agreement, and he withdrew his consent, and then that caused services to escalate. Although there was no additional evidence, and I think that is quite an interesting predicament for social workers in particular, because it is about how do we work. We are working with families on a voluntary basis. We felt it was safe enough to work under Section 17 if they were working with us, but then when they stop working with us, has the risk escalated? So in my view in that case was, should the case have always been child protection? I think that's sort of how we use Section 17 and Section 47 in this context was quite interesting.
Yeah, I guess it's important to let people know that the work we use in the paper are composite narratives. So they're made up from several live cases over the last few years, and ethically that's important. And one of the things I hope the paper does is highlight the importance of our direct practice as a side of research. So we're using autoethnography in the paper, and it explains why that's a possible way for social workers to research. So it's important that listeners hear that wasn't a direct example of a family, and the names are anonymized and so forth. But yeah, pulling together a range of cases and drawing out that illustration. If we just move to that and have a look at that on the can I just check, is the screen, are people seeing these slides on the screen? Are they not?
Yeah, the slides they are.
Oh, they're seeing the slides. Okay, so this is a composite narrative, anonymized name, but just to give some illustration to the debate we're having. Here's a man that's 40 years old, due from release from prison, convicted of distributing banned material, which is not uncommon in these sorts of situations, convicted of promoting, therefore, terrorism and fundraising, range of children under the age of 10, homeschooled, no history of social service involvement, and the police raised concerns, again, not uncommon in these cases, and for the right reasons, that police will have some information, not release it to other authorities, as is due right and ethic. Police raised concerns that the children are being radicalised to jihadist ideologies. And a number of cases open under Section 17, in this case, Mr. Malik's. And Kerry, you're right. So when a case is in a child in need situation voluntary, and if other agencies are concerned when families withdraw their permission to continue, do we initiate a higher risk threshold because of some pressure in the system? What information would come in? And as a social worker with some direct experience of these cases, it was quite lonely and sometimes quite vulnerable to hold a line that says, actually, based on what we know now, this still should require a child in need framework, and the family have a right to withdraw their permission for us to work.
It depends how you're looking at it, then, doesn't it? Because just looking at that example, we've got children that are homeschooled. We've got parents who are saying that you can't speak to the family doctor or the housing officer. So the opportunities really to be assured that the children are thriving are limited and are through a sort of funnel that's been provided by the parents. And then, so it's whether actually there's concerns about the general functioning of the family long before or parallel to the father being convicted and going to prison for distribution of material.
What I would say then is why it should have been Section 47 from the start.
Yeah.
Because
potentially, yeah.
Because if the risk was that high, because
what's the unmet need of these children? I suppose is what I'm asking.
But does unmet need and potential for significant harm, are they the same thing?
No, but we don't know in that
Yeah.
scenario, do we?
We don't, and that's the point I'm raising in this illustration, is that in several examples of direct practice, it was easy for people to marshal an argument that this required more, that we could dispense with parental permission. And I held my own in a couple of these cases and said, no, based on what we've got, what are we saying is the likelihood of significant harm? Are we saying that these children are likely to become affected by terrorist ideas and therefore action and do something horrific? I've been at several senior meetings when colleagues from different organisations have made quite raising alarming concerns. And I guess, how do we hold a social work argument that, based on what we know, evidence-based to a point, but in these cases, we're talking about the possibility in the future something will go on. Does that give the state the right to do something now on this information? The police will likely to have information about family life, rightfully so in my view, and they must provide the information appropriate to working with social workers. But I think that when a family withdraws their permission to work with us, that it shouldn't automatically, because we're working in uncertainty, I don't think in and on its own that should trump the family's rights to have their ability to withdraw consent from the state.
I hear what you're saying. I suppose for this particular scenario, I think there's an absence of data around how the children were thriving or not.
Right. Take that a bit further. Can you explain a bit more about why would that be of central concern to you as a social worker?
Because the children are potentially under anybody's, fall below anybody's radar, because they're not in school. I can't tell from that how engaged they are with health professionals, how engaged they are with other sort of community groups, churches, etc. So I would, if interwoven into that had been something along the lines that the children were thriving, I'd agree entirely with you. But it's that sort of that gap for me, that we've got children potentially under the radar. You know, I've got Kyra Ishak in the back of my mind.
Yes.
You know, so
yes.
I am guided as well by other serious case reviews and other sort of...
Let me pose this invitation back. If this was a Jewish family from Kent moving to Solihull, and the father had been convicted of benefit fraud or watching pornography, and the probation in terms of his release conditions reported to Children's Services, and he had been a model prisoner, come back and homeschooled their children, which is not uncommon in some situations, would we have the same level of interest to inquire about those children and their well-being as in this situation?
Okay, what I'll put back to you is that's not what I was asking.
Oh, okay.
What I was suggesting to you was, for me, it would have been more wholesome just to have had a sentence or a paragraph in there that illustrated that the children were thriving or weren't thriving. Just a comment, because it's a gap for me.
Yeah. I can tell you in several of these cases we weren't able to meet or see the children. And that did...
So you don't know how...
We don't, but again, it's that tremendously important distinction between what is the key role of a social worker in some of these matters. What am I using to draw on colleagues? What are colleagues using to draw on their decision making to act or not? And balancing,
really challenging.
It's really challenging. I do agree, but I do think around the country, are we debating this enough in terms of, if we look at without looking at terrorism, the rising numbers of care in England and the how are we justifying our decision making? And it may be that they're the right numbers. I can't say that, but I just think for social work and for social workers, are we really clear about our rationale for courses of action or not? And in these cases, I was really clear about my and colleagues' rationale for not initiating a higher threshold that would give me permission and mandate to dispense with parental acknowledgement. So working with and developing relationships at the same time as we live in a highly suspicious state with a lot of surveillance going on. And a number of these men knew of this because they were advised about what was going on and were advised legally they didn't have to speak to us and so forth. So it's tremendously tricky, isn't it? It's tremendously tricky.
I think one of the things that you're illustrating is the importance, and again across all social work, to continuously be critical and reflective, critical and reflective about the work we're doing, why we're doing it, and making sure that we're constantly analysing and making sure that we're making decisions for the right reasons, that we're adhering to our code of ethics. I suppose my understanding from what you're saying, and tell me if I'm misinterpreting what you're saying, is that
I'm sure you're not.
In the culture of fear that we've got at the moment, that debate and conversation and that analysis and critical reflection is being lost, and that may be fueling practice that could be determined as oppressive.
There's no doubt that our practice has moved to an authoritarian and muscular practice. There's no doubt about that, and people like Sue White and Bridget Phillips have written about this for a while, and it's really compelling reading for us to think about. And we have to ask, how come that's happened? How come we are more likely? And then again, in the paper, I think what we're trying to do is say these are children with families, and if we construct the child at risk of radicalisation or at risk of being involved in illegal terrorist offences, going to ban rallies and so forth, does that then, is the logic of that argument that the family are somehow the risky site for the child to live in? And does that fuel our argument that, well, the child, therefore, logic is to move out of that situation? And I just think that if we pause and stop and say, well, what is my social work position in any case of a family life? What would I want to do with a family and with their permission and with the engaged relationship? How do I hold in mind their dreams and desires when actually I might be being encouraged to think about it in terms of getting in there and sorting it out? And that authoritarian backdrop, I think, is just something that we've got to just continue to look at and visit and ask, how come our practice has shifted away so much from that humane ethic that I think social work needs to absolutely come back to and promote?
Well, I listened to a worker speak about, I can't remember where I heard them, but I think one of the questions he posed was, he'd say, what would the system look like for us to never need to take a child into care again? Like, what would it look like for us never need to remove a child? And when you put that, and when you put that to social workers, I think they find that, I think that there is a struggle there, because I think, and I, coming from a child protection background, I struggle with it too, because I think I feel that there'll always be contexts where children aren't safe to remain at home. But then it's interesting, because you think, if you had if you had a blank check, what would a society look like?
That's how I think, the things that you were talking about earlier, and I was talking about proactive work and planning ahead and creating shared values and ethics and all of these things you talked about. Really, you alluded to adult poverty affecting child poverty. If you end adult poverty, because I'm a pay analyst and I work on inequality and unemployment, then you end child poverty. A lot of the problems are the effects of, the society in which the adults are operating in. And when just looking at this example, point 1 and 2 is political. Who decides who goes to prison? Let's break it down, Who decides what's right and wrong?
I have a different view. I have a straightforward view about prisons and crime. If someone breaks the law and commits a crime, then we have a very clear rationale in a civil society of doing that. I've got no problem with that. Well, the concern I think we're raising is that we have a range of meetings and processes when people come out of prison, and in these situations, in these cases, they're being debated at quite a high level, and concerns are being raised about children. And I'm asking us to be really clear about the power of the state to do something when, in fact, if it wasn't terrorism or radicalisation, would we have the same response? And I just want us to question that, really. I don't think it's uniformed, but I do think that these particular cases, we're all...
Inequality.
I do.
It's a crime.
But I do. But
so
I think.
If we fix that first, then you reduce the crime and reduce the people going to prison.
Yeah. Well, two things in my mind in response to that. I think that we are also talking about certain groups of certain families. In this case, families, particular religious persuasion and belief structure, and also I think where do social workers take that analysis? If a social worker sees that we are overly focused on Muslim families, which we argue this illustration gives us, because we're not seeing high numbers of children from far-right families and other forms of violent behaviour are coming to our attention in terms of belief structures of families, not action. But if we are getting a number of these cases through the country, and we are, then do social workers bring that analysis somewhere? What are the forums within which, is it through BASW? Is it through union? Is it through principal social workers? How do we gather the intelligence of our practice that on the micro level for this particular family illustration, we might argue backwards and forwards about, and you're right, you don't have all the information. I appreciate that, ethically, of course. In a research paper, a debate paper, we're not using live actual cases. It's not ethical to do so. And so autoethnography gives us a way to organise the presentation of family life so that we can debate this. But I do think that as practice issues like this emerge from time to time, and you could argue CSC and missing, and we've got radicalisation, where do social workers bring their analysis of...
That's the central government. Whoever
But how? How do they do that?
How? Well, in the same way that you do social advocacy. If I have a cause and I'm concerned about something, you highlight it through your professional body. You can do that. So through your British Association of Social Workers, and then that can feed into central government. Whoever's giving you the information down, you feed it back to them up. That's how I look at it.
But I'm not sure our culture in social work is one that invites, encourages, or makes that happen.
Change that, and that's through HR practice and working culture, and understanding that you guys are competent, you guys understand what you need to do, and you need to feed that back and articulate it, and not to be afraid of it affecting your career.
But you could argue that potentially one reason for bringing in a very sort of quantitative performance framework is about beating you into sort of submission so that you're not challenging.
That's right.
I know how
it works.
And for me, it's about having a safe space as well to have these conversations. We're under,
rules.
well, it's not even that. We're under, as a profession, we're under intense scrutiny.
Yeah.
We're named and shamed in the media. In terms of our regulatory body, the HCPC, social workers are one of the most represented professions. And I think in terms of, this is such a controversial and sort of highly sensitive area that I think people and I'm sort of aware of some of the things we're saying and making sure, thinking about my responses. I think that it is we do police ourselves as a profession a lot more than other professions. And I'm saying that generally, I think it is difficult to have these conversations when it's such a contentious issues in a way that feels like we're safe and that we're protected and that we won't be paraphrased or taken out of context or made to feel that we're not working in a way that's protected.
But I do think we could as well.
Sorry.
One at a time.
Come on.
I do think we're very effective as well in terms of, I'm sitting thinking of some of these meetings I've sat in, and what the social work, if you like, corner will be constantly doing is, in a respectful way, where's your evidence? How can you evidence that? Because some of our partners will talk quite speculatively without any real substantial evidence.
And I think it's because our partners don't see us as effective unless we're removing.
Yeah. And doing what they ask us to.
Yeah, and I think that, and my sort of, and this is a complete from personal experience, and some of the conversations that I've had throughout my career is that the nuanced relationship-based work that we're doing between sort of assessment and removal, closure, whatever way the conversation goes, that's not necessarily appreciated by our partner organisations.
Definitely.
And so then we're just seen as ineffectual. And I think because removal is so stark and so obvious, that's us being seen as effective. That's us seen as doing something.
Well, I argue, why should children wake up in strangers' bedrooms with strange smells?
Absolutely.
And the risks.
We know that it is not the solution. The outcomes for children who have been through the care system compared to.
So what would help? What would help social work and therefore our society feel more at ease with perhaps working with more uncertainty? Because I think there's a myth that child removal provides a certain objective kind of response that somehow the child is safe, and we know that there's risks associated with that. But if we're to work with families like this family and to leave the children there and not execute more power, because I'm curious about your responses to the notion of who has the power in this particular illustration. Well, whose narrative, what narratives are dominant and what narratives are missing, whose voices are silenced, and what might the social worker focus on because of those narratives, and what might they not focus on that we might like them to focus on in order to be able to say, as I did in several meetings, this is not the duty of the state to interrupt this family anymore.
For me, there's an element of neglect in this case. If you just strip back the radicalisation, and let's say that, you know, this was a father coming out of prison for any violent crime, my concern is that, you know, the children aren't in schools, they're missing out on that social emotional development.
Oh, they're homeschooled, it's perfectly legal.
Yeah, it is illegal, and I suppose that, but for me, I suppose it's seeing the child as a child in the community, and I wonder about that, whether that, and this isn't, and this, they may have been a child in their community, they may have had community links, this isn't picked up in your case study.
Yeah.
I would obviously have to do my own assessment, but in terms,
former colleague, I verify the capacity of that. Yeah.
In terms of that, it would be, I think for me, there are issues in terms of how we categorise different forms of abuse and neglect as more and less harmful.
But isn't there a danger, if we extrapolate that argument further, that the state therefore has an all-consuming involvement with family life? And I think statutory social work, I don't think we are clear enough of being a residual response in a civil society on behalf of things when they're not working well. I like the fact that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child says children have rights to be free from harm and abuse, they have rights to live with family, and the family have rights of privacy from the state. And I think that convention's so well crafted. And again, in social organisations, how many organisations really bring that alive to help? So I used it in these cases. I argued simply that the power of the state could harm these families.
Make them feel more marginalised.
Well, make them feel more marginalised, and perversely, aren't we then encouraging potentially people to join quiet offline groups? I mean, how do we invite and engage? And in some illustrations, my work with families was around education, you know, particularly around homeschooling. So the children have rights for education. And I want to understand from the parents and adults in the family system, are they supportive of that idea? Are they not supportive of that idea? That would help me think about notions of neglect. And in some situations, I was very clear. Their belief around their child's future, of not committing criminal offences and having a criminal record, of having education, helped me be swayed around that family's right to get on and do so, even with convictions. Because again, in this case example, what are we talking about? Convicted of terrorism is not a straightforward idea. Belonging to prescribed groups, fundraising, promoting of terrorism, what does it actually mean in practice? And therefore, what does it mean for those children? And can the family come together? Can we use more of the family structure to come together to say, actually, you might hold some views that actually fundraising to support a prescribed group is okay. Where in the family can we challenge that?
I think the other thing for me is, with this family, you know, you've got dad who's been knocked up. So leaving that family to one side, I'm guessing, I haven't done any research, but I'm guessing that the vast majority of families are quite perplexed, worried, very, very worried, I guess, at the moment. And how do they keep their children safe from society's view that's negative, but also the risk that their child could be radicalised? How can that parent talk safely to people about, what do I need to do? I'm worried about my son, my daughter. You know,
a lot of this the documentary I watched recently, a lot of the radicalisation was happening without the parents' knowledge. It was happening through the computers.
And that's what I've heard, yeah.
Forums and a lot of these so it was a I think maybe a panorama, and it was talking about how a lot of the teenagers were contacted through Facebook without their parents' knowledge, and a lot of you had a generation of very tech-savvy kids compared to sort of less computer literate parents, and they were being told, very intelligent children telling their parents, I'm doing homework, being very well behaved.
But it does, but also that particular view and narrative, while good examples, it also continues to remind us and help us focus on the vulnerability of those children as children and being vulnerable. What it doesn't do is open up the fact that how can we have computer access to things like political regimes, inequality, family members that live in war-torn states? How do we get to a point where actually getting online isn't demonized so much, and that the child is not constructed as the radical victim in all of this, needing to be rescued? That's the delicacy, I think, and we're trying to tease out so that actually.
I think you had an interest, and just going back to your point about social workers being more comfortable holding risk. I think it's a really, really complex, a massively complex issue, because I think for starters it goes back to us being very clear on what our role is, and so we're able to hold accountability a lot more easily. What was our role? What wasn't our role? What are we accountable? What are we not accountable for? And I think also truly working together, so everyone within the system, being responsible for safeguarding. And I think as a society, and we have to make sure that we try and move away from this blame culture.
But I think that's an interesting point about safeguarding as everyone's business, because it seems to me that it's someone's business more than others. And I do think it's a social worker business to be involved in safeguarding. We're GPs and child protection conferences and so forth. I just think that I'm not convinced that the safeguarding is everyone's business is always the right rhetoric as well. That can often leave us overly, it can create anxiety around not knowing. And like the issue with homeschooling, until they change the law in this country, it's perfectly legitimate for families to select home education if they so choose.
So what do you think would make social workers more comfortable to hold risk?
I think social workers being absolutely clear on the origins of the profession around justice and rights, and being able to frame decision making and interaction around the rights, the right of a child to be free from harm and neglect, but the right of a family to get on with their ability to away from the state's eye. And I think statutory social work has got to really be stronger about that. I think there's other versions of social work that are perfectly legitimate, that have a different mandate. And the community development is a great example of that. But for statutory social work in this context with these cases, I would love social work to be much stronger and render arguments about justice, and say that actually what we argue in the paper are some parts of community being more affected than others. This is not an even playing field. This is not democratic. The state's eye is on certain sorts of families. And again, I make the point, we do need frameworks where counter-terrorism work exists and continues. And we know that our colleagues in many services have offset many horrific events in the country that we will never know about. But in so saying that, there's also the role that social work could do more. And it could provide more analysis of the practice that's going on, and that's why we wrote this paper, because we don't have a lot of research. Social workers don't offer their casework in ethical ways through autoethnography or other methods, but we lack real research about practice. Day-to-day realities of social work is hidden. House calls this an invisible trade. So if we're to understand practice and learn from it and do more of what works, where's our body of evidence about it? And again, nationally, I'd like more work done on a national perspective of our social work offer, helpful or otherwise, to this particular set of examples. I think we could really do something quite helpful to both social education and practice, and certainly leadership, because so much of this is off the record. And as you said earlier, there'll be meetings when there'll be some indication of some information and not others. And I don't think it's the role of police or education or health to teach us how to do this. This is our job as social workers to come to those meetings with a very clear rationale of what my mandate is, what the law says, and what my ethics say about my ability to advocate on behalf of that family, not to be overly intervened, but on behalf of those children in the family to have a proportionate but well thought through and evidence-informed response if needed. And in some cases, for me and others to say, no, we are not, I'm not prepared to make an argument that we go through a higher threshold just because the family have withdrawn their consent.
Well, I always struggled with cases where, for instance, the police would call you up.
Is that a question for me?
The police would call you up and say, parent has been arrested, they're on bail not to return to the house for whatever crime. Maybe nothing to do with the children, but for another crime. And then they wouldn't be allowed contact with the children, but you would keep the case, you would keep the case open, sort of waiting for the sort of whether dad was to be or parent was to be charged. And you were sort of holding these, and I have heard of cases where they're just sort of, like a parent has been accused of something. Usually, in the case I've heard of, it's been the dad. Typically, sexual abuse outside of the family. So the children have never been known to social services, showed no evidence, have never made any disclosures. The family would never have come known to us if this other crime hadn't been reported. And so you end up having another parent who's quite safe, the harmful parent out of the house, but yet while you're waiting to see if the bail conditions are ended or if it will go to court, you end up having these cases that you sort of hold on Section 47 or Section 17 for a long time. And I feel like that's the point I'm trying to make is that I sometimes feel like social workers are just expected to plug a certain gap.
Well, I would argue back to that. I would simply argue ethically it's not justified for the state to have open records on children and families without a mandate or a rationale. I don't understand why we're not agitated about that or irritated about that.
It used to irritate me.
Yeah, good. Speak up and hence you're involved with BASW.
Because I think if a parent's under bail conditions not to return to the house, well, we can't police that in the middle of the night. The police have put those bail conditions in.
It sounds like there's a building expectation that we are going to resolve all of the ills of a society, and I think we do need a much more realistic view. And I come back to that point we said earlier about what is the role and mandate of statutory social work in this country? What do we want it to be? And how do we therefore deliver it? And as I said earlier, we need to do much more research from a practice perspective. And I know it's not easy when I'm, busy working away as chief social worker in Birmingham and working on some papers with colleagues. But this paper has got a lot of interest, and I had a number of people contact us about it because we're trying to illustrate that these are yes, they're composite narratives, but these are families in England today who have had a set of social work responses that in another social worker's hands could have gone very differently. In a different borough. And is that okay? I was visited a borough recently talking to a principal social worker who was really helpful about some of these cases, but my sense from that work was that they were much more interventionist, much more likely to work with the police to go around in groups of 2 social workers and 2 police officers. And I think if I hold on to those justice and rights debates, it helps me lead my profession with practice that doesn't rely on the state joining forces in a way that is overly powerful for families. Because in these cases, I don't think we're maximising family involvement. And I think families might be, I can't say this for sure, but I imagine there's a certain amount of fear and anxiety, mistrust of what the state might do. So I think, how does social work carve out more of a helpful, humane response in these cases that also, without the evidence of casework for us to build on, we're still finding our way? And the prevent duty has been in place now since July 1, 2015. It's now 2018, and we have very little social work research, knowledge, debate. I know the PSW magazine's about to produce a little article. I can see you feverishly writing away there. But, and there has been some work in Birmingham. One of the projects I led on was family group conferencing and having that as an offer. And again, we've got some really, really good police leads in the city who are wanting to work differently. They realise, I think, that if we're going to get people to understand what we're worried about, we have to have them at the table. Another piece of work is offering signs of safety, looking at some police social work action together, because actually how we understand risk in these cases will be different from different agencies.
And being very clear with the families about when our intervention is going to end and what we need to see for us to no longer be involved.
Yes, and the illustration you gave before, Kerry, about cases encouraged to stay open because we're waiting for the end of a court matter, then a social worker marshalling an argument that it's unjust and unethical, would be compelling for a manager, a senior manager, and a social worker note on a file, because families have rights to read our files. They've got rights to come back. Children have rights to come back and see what we did and why we did it.
And I think what you said was at the beginning in terms of that label that has been applied to the child, the family, that, you know, they're at risk of radicalisation, that doesn't go away unless we can demonstrate that there's been change and there's been growth and development.
And you don't know what impact that's going to have on that 5-year-old in 15 years,
Absolutely.
25 years' time.
Absolutely.
But also, when a child's labelled as at risk of radicalisation, how do they become unlabelled of
That's
that?
what I meant. That's exactly what I meant.
I think it's
That's what I'm saying.
really complicated. And so how we record these matters needs our careful consideration. And I think that's the stuff I think is yet to play out. What does it mean to have a record of a child 5 years ago at risk of radicalisation? If someone gets hold of that now, how does that shape the thinking? What are we looking at when we go to the home? All that sort of stuff. So I just think these are really powerful ideas, and we are routinely going through practice with I don't think enough research and enough debate to really frame ways of doing it. And I think around the country it's a postcode lottery. And I don't think that's good enough. And hence BASW's invitation to lead on some good debate about this. I think there are vulnerable adults in social work terms, and there are people living with major mental illness who are also being responded to under the banner of radicalisation and terrorism. We're talking about children today, but we could equally be talking about vulnerable adults. The other matter that we need to think about is people returning from war zones. What's our social work offer for young people, young adults, people that have gone out to the Daesh when they were 18, 17, coming back as 23-year-old parents? How are we constructing those people that do have rights? They don't lose their human rights because they've gone to a war zone. We might have to think about how we respond to that in terms of what's gone on for them. They're undoubtedly exposed to trauma. But what are our social work models available? We've certainly got a criminal model. I mean, 5 years ago, there was political rhetoric around detaining, and there was something recently in the media around a politician who basically said they can stay there. So how do we as social workers argue for the rights of people to return back to a society, whereas places like Denmark and Holland, they've got projects set up to house, to provide education, and to help people get employment, so that they fit into exactly what you were saying before about people participating in society and having a social work response that's not about criminalisation. And if there are criminal activities done in Germany, if you've gone to the war zone and come back, you are a criminal and you are in an institution. But the very first thing that the state does in Germany is offer you a social worker. And yes, you are imprisoned, so there's a certain amount of someone coming to visit me, the social worker's coming. But what the agencies in Germany tell me is that the social work response is simply social work. They engage with the family, another social worker engages with the person incarcerated, another social worker engages with the family system, and together they work in a way to invite the person back to their family and community. And I think that is really, really exciting.
So it's a role in social work whereby you bring people back into it. You make a person feel like the society has a space for them.
Reintegration, facilitate their change and growth.
And it's about creating a society where everyone feels welcome, everyone has a place, and everyone has a stake in it.
Exactly. And that's a different argument from, are you psychologically damaged and are you at risk because your psychology or psychiatry is so vulnerable to these ideas on the internet? It shifts our thinking. And I think that's what I think social work in this country could really learn from.
I think there's two parallel pieces of work, isn't there? There's the statutory role of social work, and there's the community development, community integration. So we've got to have both. And
I do agree.
the political framework and the fallout from sort of unthought through policies.
But also, how many of our third sector agency partners, community social workers, community workers, are they at child protection conferences? Are they part of our statutory offer? I'm not sure we're welcoming in many of our community partners that we could. I've overheard stories of different different cases around the country where people are told not to work with certain community groups because they are not approved by the Home Office. Well, who's deciding who's worthwhile for the family, and how do we get that balance right? Excuse me. If we want families to be participating with us and we want to understand this power inequality and dilemma around families really being welcomed into the practice, then I think the family have got to take a lead in who's important to them. And I think social work should be able to make some space. If other agency partners say, I'm not comfortable, we have to hear that. But there is something about a professionalised, which is what we argue in the paper, there's a very professionalised network operating around these cases, which to a certain extent uninvites the family, uninvites the community, and certainly uninvites the third sector NGO. And notions of uncertainty can lead into notions of suspicion. And I just think it's in need of us, and great supervision, to just stop and pause and just to start unravel this and find out whose narrative dominates the case of the case we talked about, what voices are missing, what voices do we want to bring in, and how as social workers we might do that in contest to other agencies like the police, not to disrespect our colleagues at all.
I agree with exactly what you're saying now. Obviously, I'm talking from a community perspective, and when you've talked about referencing other agencies, you talk between the police and yourselves, but they're very similar. You're both appointed by government, both public sector organisations, so we have to look at everybody's perspective, and you get a wider perspective from community organisations.
But it's the different roles within a multi-agency safeguarding working world that I think we really have to do more work, and it's our job, it's social work's job. I was a member of the College of Social Work, very proudly a member of the college, as well as BASW, but you know, in the college we argue that it's not for others to define who we are, it's really for us to define our profession. And there's 110 years of history for us to draw on. It shouldn't just be that our workplaces define us. My social work is about my profession that I take to a workplace, but I often hear colleagues talk about the workplace and the job they do, and how do we bring that back? Just before we get to the questions, there's a couple of illustrations I want to just highlight from the case studies in the paper. We talk about this notion of individuation, that what we're saying there, that this notion of child rescue and child focus, overly focus on the child in need of state intervention, is encouraged by two things. One, the psychological dominance that says that children, argues that the vulnerability of children must be our key concern, and they are so vulnerable that their psychology is likely to be influenced and therefore go down this road of radicalization. It's often called the conveyor belt theory or the ironing board theory, that the correlation between somehow being vulnerable today, going online, quickly, oh my gosh, they're going to be radicalized. It's a very complicated process, radicalized. It's the literature I'm aware of, very complicated set of issues that some people just do not go down the road of violent extremism. There may well be extremist, radical thought, belief structure guiding someone's worldview. But when does it tip over to violence? And I think in England, unlike other European countries, we've merged these two ideas together and it becomes really complicated for social workers. And that police reports and police information is very powerful. Police can give social services some information. They must retain the information that's private for the proceedings that they may well be part of. But when they offer reports, how do we as social workers understand the limits of those reports? And if there are indications that the police may indicate things are more risky, these are very powerful relationships. And in the paper we argue that in its own can set up responses that invite us to do certain things. And the other thing that's happening in social work at the moment, I'm interested in BASW's view about this, particularly in Australia, and the recent case review from Brighton and Hove about a young lad that went off to the Daesh war zone, is this focus on trauma. Now, I'm distinguishing trauma from those in the war zone coming back. There's no doubt in my mind that children, adults exposed to war places will have exposure to trauma and be traumatized. But in social work in the Western world, there's this growing emphasis on a trauma lens. And I think, again, we need to pay attention to that, because is that encouraging more of this notion of vulnerability to the point of needing to be rescued? So if the trauma lens is bright, then my focus is going to be on protecting children from being traumatized. Now, again, where's the social political context around that? Where's the resiliency and notions that actually kids can get through really difficult situations, families can cope with all sorts of tremendously difficult situations? Does the state, in terms of some of this emphasis, where might this take us, is the question we're posing there. And the second kind of major issue that we think from the paper really is this notion of distrust. If And we argue that these case studies, and they are composite, remember, it's important to remember that these aren't direct illustrations, but they're pulled together from a number of different cases. In all of that experience, it seems to me that family is easily closed off and constructed as posing a risk. And I think for our practice, therefore, it's easy for social workers to say, I don't need to involve. I can work with my professional network, and the family will be told what we're doing. And I think in those cases, more likely that notions of thresholds can move and wane based on professional networks, not on new evidence or new issues of concern for children. And therefore, we argue that ethical and humane social work is easily compromised. In the illustration, files open, recorded, definitions, and decision-making can be framed in terms of legitimacy. I'm able to do it on behalf of the state, decision to go to court, seek orders, and a few years ago, wardship orders were sought on a number of young people. And I just wonder if we do that, if that will be the case today. Bye. Okay. In the paper, we're posing these issues as a point of challenge and of interest to social workers. And to close up, before we open up the questions, really, is this notion of strengths-based questions. I think I've covered that in terms of the prevent duty. It's really important to me that social workers understand the prevent duty. I'm not sitting here today getting into the is it good or is it bad debate. We need to move on from that, because actually the reality is social workers must do this. It's a duty, and if I fail in my duty, I'm neglecting my professional orientation. But delivering on the duty is not straightforward, is what we're saying in the paper, and understanding that, I think, will help us do great practice. I think for me, this is an image I love in terms of connections, relationships, the strength involved in people around children and vulnerable adults. And so just in the paper closes really, and we don't sort of sit there and suggest that it's all doom and gloom, that actually social work has some really good methods available to us to act really well and ethically. And I'm a huge proponent of signs of safety and family group conferencing. As a Kiwi social worker, I would say that about FGC. But there's also some growing debate, particularly in the psychology literature, around Tony Ward's work around Good Lives model, and Anna Gupta, her work on capabilities approach, and then adult social care, this asset-based community development work that's really exciting. And so in the paper, we close off by saying, yes, we're posing out some of the challenges and issues to watch and how to think about that, but also hopefully saying to practitioners, well, look, there are some very well evidenced models of practice that if you are working with cases of this nature, here's some ways we think that would be helpful to you. And in a new paper that's just come out with Surinder and I and Anna Gupta, we focus on the capabilities approach, signs of safety, to really bring more illustration. Because what we're trying to do, I suppose, in this work is not write these things and hopefully sit on the shelf, but actually write these things and come to seminars like this so that actually practitioners can have something helpful as well as something quite engaging. So I'll kind of close there. I see there's some questions on the board. There might be some debate in the room that you want to pick up. I hope that was interesting and helpful.
Yeah.
Good.
I think it's always just important, whatever area of social work, so I'm just aware this is quite a controversial area, we're just constantly having that reflection and debate and discussion. So like, I think it's not about not being afraid to have these discussions. Like it's okay to, and I always think it's okay to disagree.
Yes, I do agree. Okay, I think while we point out in the paper about the rise of the professionalised network, I think that's probably always kind of been there in terms of our safeguarding, working together. And there's good rationale research about why that's important. But I think it's okay for us to say if that's occurring, what's not occurring.
And you know, I listened to something interesting, and just in terms of social work debate, and I think it's a wider societal thing, is it was a TED talk, and they were saying we're more polarised in our views, and we're more likely to sort of stop being friends with someone over their political or whatever views. And actually what that means isn't that we're sort of becoming more informed and more aware. We're actually not talking to each other. We're not having debate, and we're not having... And I think that that's something that we're losing as a society. And I think actually it should feel okay to have conversations, especially as social workers, because we are exercising power, and we do...
Yes, most definitely.
We learn so much through that conversation now, don't we?
But it's like you're saying, it's in terms of strengths-based questions, it's where are you, where am I, and why are we in different places?
Yeah, it opens up a conversation about how I know what I know and what I'm drawing on, which may well, clearly all of us can continue to keep learning and growing and thinking. I really value that about social work. I do worry, though, that in many workplaces, this isn't the culture. And it requires quite senior people to see this as important. And in the teaching partnership that I'm a chair of in the West Midlands, with 10 local authorities and the University of Birmingham, we got a significant grant to really say practice leadership is not someone's job in a senior table now and again. It's everyone's ability in social work to lead their practice. And I think the most senior people in organisations have got to lead through notions of justice and rights, because they're social work leaders. And I think managerialism is all dominant, and it's there. But I think some exciting developments going on in this part of the country. I can say that there are some significant senior counter-terrorism leads from police and other agencies who are really interested and helpful and working with us around how can we bring some of these practice responses to their services, and police have a different role, a different analysis model than social work.
But they're a different profession.
Exactly. And a different mandate. Now and again, those mandates might move and they might slightly cross over, but we've got to work harder at positioning social work as a valid, legitimate activity, mandate mostly in law, to do something on behalf of society that may well, in terms of this pre-crime space, may position social workers in a very precarious way. And I think the BASW and the profession, all of us really that can help, need to be able to help if that situation was to occur and a social worker is accused of neglecting a family in this situation. How are we as a profession to marshal a kind of a supporting argument that actually uncertainty and pre-crime still means they're delivering on the duty? In the cases I'm illustrating, there was quite a lot of criticism in some around my advocacy that we did no further, and not getting into case details, of course, but it's not an easy landscape to be in. And I think we as a profession, again, delighted BASW will take a lead on some of these seminars, is how can we work together to form a more informed capacity for us to withstand a time of tragedy or critique. How do we do that together?
I think the landscape's really, to state the obvious at the moment, HCPC, offset, I think it's a very, very challenging landscape for social work.
I agree.
But we do have to own our profession.
Yes. I think you're absolutely right. Other countries don't have this crisis of professional articulation.
Some years ago, we recruited some social workers in from Canada, I think it was. Canada or the US. And the way they were valued by the courts, their practice experience in their country was completely different to what they experienced in the UK.
Yeah, there is something curious about now and where that we must understand and kind of think together about why in this particular context is that the experience where other nations have very different. My experience in social work in New Zealand was very different when I got here.
I think it's public sector workers in general are
in
very
the UK.
in this country.
I think
Social workers in particular.
Yes.
So should we go to the questions?
Yeah,
Right.
conscious that there's people probably waiting. So these questions might link back to a little bit earlier because they've asked as they've seen fit. So does this? Do you want to read that? Does this?
Does not. I can't read it.
Does
Does
this
not.
not link, Tony, again to the policing consent dilemmas we have faced in the past and how the state has always used the social worker as a mobiliser for the control of minorities and the othering of others? What is a terrorist? This is not a parenting issue. I'm sorry, but we profoundly disagree with colleague here.
Okay, I'm not sure what that quite relates to, but I do think our colleague over here. I do. That's a good question. I do think that a confident mandate role social worker will be able to withstand being sequestered into a professionalised network, as we explain in the paper. And I think we must work collectively and collaboratively. No debate about that. but understanding where my role begins and ends will mean that I'm not likely to turn into an arm of the security state. In 2015, Surinder and I, one of the authors of this paper, wrote a paper for your journal, actually, Practice Social Work in Action. And in that paper, we argued, social work, be careful, pay attention, this is coming, this is something we must debate more. And we were surprised. We got a lot of good feedback about the paper at the time, but we were surprised that there wasn't more debate about how can social work resist becoming part of the security state. If we're passed information from a certain agency, police, home border, home office, otherwise, where's our ethic around what we do with that, involving families and their rights to know what we've got and why we've got it? How do we balance that? And I think it's very easy for the professionalised network to set up ways of emphasis and narrative that render the family just not partner to that practice.
Well, I always say to students, be really, because I'm fortunate enough to go into universities, I say always really think about your news, make sure you're aware of what's going on politically and be really critical of it, because what's being said in Parliament, what's being said in the papers, that is what we will use to go into someone's home, and that's the mandate that we use. So what they say in Parliament and how they discuss things in Parliament will direct the mandate of how we are then going into people's homes.
Well, it directed the future of Sharon Soothmouth, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Is there another question?
Yes, more.
Okay.
Social workers need to know that there is a role for discussing this radicalisation narrative, for focusing on rights, responsibility and a freedom to think, prevent, collapses everything into potential threats of violence is enough to be in family life. And we need to think about the harm that causes and marks that leads.
Yeah, I think that's a really good comment. I agree. I think that a simplistic application of any social policy can harm people. And in the name of helping, I think sometimes social work can harm and injure others. So yes, we must understand the prevent agenda. And like I said earlier, I do believe that having a structure of counterterrorism in a civil society is a very good stage. And while there are countries, Germany and others, doing some fantastic community and social work in this issue, they lack a national strategy. And they look to us for our strategy. I guess what we're trying to do with this work is say, yes, we share that agenda, but it's not straightforward. And social work has a unique role to at times advocate for families not to have the hard arm of the state. And without going into other case detail, for me it comes to the core of social work understanding the relationship between the family and the state. And that with family permission mostly, our ability to navigate that, negotiate that, and to make sets of decisions and influences that hopefully leave people better off. But I know in some of these cases, courses of inaction may have led to poor outcomes for some children, and that's a difficult thing to hold, because you're balancing on the one hand a disproportionate state response with an outcome where kids may have left the jurisdiction, and that's really tricky. And how do we, as a profession, as a practitioner, as a senior leader, how do I set a culture where actually that will be something we'll talk about, something we won't blame, but we'll understand when there are many others in our system and society who will quickly, I won't mention certain newspapers, but quickly point out the problems and faults therein. So it's really difficult. But I think this illustration, as I said earlier today, we could be talking about a range of social work illustrations. I think it's the heart of some of the challenges of contemporary social work in England at this time that we're really fleshing out, I think. So I agree. That was a long answer, wasn't it?
Okay.
I do think the question was helpful.
Yes. And the next question. In some schools, pressure from schools to remove children who are seen as difficult and are advised to homeschool them. Anecdotal evidence from BME communities.
Anecdotal evidence that BME communities is disproportionately affected.
So homeschool in this case may not have been the choice of the family.
Interesting.
I've had that.
Yeah.
I've had cases where that's happened.
Yeah.
I think homeschooling education is really interesting, and it comes up time to time in Parliament to debate and discuss. I also have a view that our schools at this time wield an enormous amount of power in the system about children and family life. And I really value our colleagues inside schools, but I've always been curious why they don't employ social workers. they have designated school leads, they have other colleagues that do a range of activity that are social and community outward facing. But, you know, if schools employed social workers to do some of that social intervention, I wonder what difference that might make in our school system, because I think schools can be presenting things in a very an important way, but I think the power involved in the education staff at the moment, there's a high focus on children, rightfully so at one level, but then schools are also highly attuned to that focus. And I think that how do we get that in a way that really helps families? Is it really helping families? Do schools always talk to the family before they refer to social care? Would be an illustration. And if they don't, why not? And how can we help them? And again, some parts of the world, school social workers are a very respected part of social work. Yet in England, we have, I met a DSL, not in the city, recently at a conference, who said to me she spends half her week looking for children. And I said, do you mean like simply out there looking? Yes, she said, pounding the pavements. I said, aren't you teaching math or something? Isn't that the police's job? Who's running around looking for children? I mean, that seems to me, right, that was an extreme example, but it seems to me that schools are really important places for children. But I wonder if we've moved too far into the expectation that they are doing all things for all children, and social work is trying to negotiate that landscape.
Suffering the same experience as social care, though. They're expected to do much more, with much less, and they're under a high level of scrutiny and
public expectation, political expectation, and funding, and so on and so forth. I just wish their main mandate and their narrative was around education, and their duty to provide education. When do we argue back that schools are failing children? And the illustration that the colleagues put on the board was around schools potentially indicating that you could homeschool your child if there's too much trouble. Yeah. It's anecdotal. It's hard to make a comment on that because I'd like to see some more research.
But I suppose in that context, that school is defining its success by its levels of, by its SATS level, so by how it's educating the child. And their view would be that that one child is affecting the education of 30 other children.
It's hard to know, it's a bit anecdotal, but
anecdotal.
It's interesting.
We've got two colleagues in the room that have both had experience of that, and it just, I think, wider research might be interesting.
I think that's an excellent example. I think it's an excellent idea. I again, a bit like social work practice, we are largely invisible. We don't have a lot of research-informed evidence, and that's why this paper I think is interesting, because we're using research methods to bring alive casework in an ethical way that's not breaching anyone's rights for confidentiality, but trying to raise the complexity of practice, which I think the education, schooling, social work interface is a really important one.
But what I'm saying is where I disagree with you, because you're saying schools should focus on education.
Yes.
But the issue is that child who's got BME issues, they are focusing on education. They're focusing on the education of 29 other students at the cost of one. Whereas if they were to, I think schools actually need to focus on helping to create well-rounded human beings. I know a few adults that are homeschooled that didn't learn to read until they were 8 because their parents view of education is that children should approach education in a fun way, and if they should read when they want to read and not be forced to read.
See, I think, and again, a theme from the paper is the professionalised network idea, and I think the network that I think is a equally, if not more important institution in society is the family. And when I hear ministers and political leaders talking about our society, and often an emphasis on what schools should be doing morally and intellectually, the next breath I want is someone to say, but the family's key job is that moral, intellectual culture where their thirst of knowledge is met by education. And I think there's some unrealistic expectations on many institutions, but the institution I think that we're saying is at risk of not being at the table for these cases is the family and the family structure, which is why in Birmingham we're using FGC as an offer and saying to people, don't be frightened of social workers. Actually, who are the people in your family system who no one wants their kid to be on a subway with a backpack full of bombs or heading off to Syria? No parent family that I've ever talked to in this area of work for 5 years has indicated they will be with us to help us do our work. But I think the unrealistic expectation on schools sometimes positions them as potentially quite risk-averse contexts. And I think that needs more debate and potentially more research.
It's about schools being educators, in a wholesome way, isn't it? Rather than, I think schools are sort of stuck in the same way as we are with our Ofsted frameworks. They are too.
The regulation is an incredibly interesting bit of our influence.
Managed through and through, aren't they? In a very narrow way.
But it's also about how the light's being shined, isn't it? It's easy to say it's social workers, it's schools. These are the organisations that are failing our children. Because actually, if we were to say, if we were to focus on the role of the family, first of all, right to private family life, but also that's a much more expensive issue for those sort of wider early intervention, those community resources, those things.
But I think there's enough money. You see, I've thought this for years. I've been doing it for 10 years. I think there's plenty of money for children's services and child welfare. We are just using it in rather ways that I think we could reorientate. And I think that the family is the institution that I want much more attention and social work focus on, because we're talking about children today, but we could be talking about vulnerable adults, people living with mental illness, people who are isolated and lonely and vulnerable. I just think, where are the people? And there's a lovely project in Germany that using FGC in the converse way, not bringing everyone together on day one, but starting with an individual and saying who's important to you and connecting them to somebody else, and then somebody else joins that network and somebody else. And that's a very different network idea than the one we're saying dominates this area of work, which is the professionalised networks. It's the people that are meaningful, that can make the difference. And when you get some elder from a family who says, I'm not having this behaviour in my family life, that's a hell of a lot more powerful than Tony Stanley, the social worker, saying, if you don't do this, we're off to Section 47, So I think, how do we leverage power and influence in a creative way to build capacity, which I think is what BASW's message and the International Federation says, is about justice, capacity, the promise of what we want for our society. And I don't believe statutory social workers can't do this. I just think we're not leading it in a way that enables this kind of thinking, which is why these seminars, I think,
it's development. It's our development as well, isn't it? How do we engage families? Section 17, voluntary, to then engage with family group conferencing, and there's now, so it's really our skills at bringing families on board.
See, I would go back, just to clarify, I agree that there's probably enough money in the system, and I think we're not focusing the systems in the country as a whole. I think we're not focusing enough on, so I think to look in some of the Scandinavian countries and some of the projects that they run, they are very family focused and early intervention. And I think that in this austerity, benefits, stealers, saints and scroungers sort of culture that we're living on, and that we're reluctant to sort of provide services at the early.
But see, I don't know. I'm running a bit of a theory in my head, and there's some literature supporting this partly, but early intervention can also be a gateway to child protection. And I worry that this notion of helping early and then these models that bring the kind of continuum from early into child protection, I really like the distinction between statutory social work and other forms of help for families. And I think we do well to differentiate between this notion that the local authority or a children's trust provides all this early stuff in a mechanism of central government anyway, because we just run the risk of us offering so much out there, and then when a family enters some of our systems, they can be with us for quite a long time. And I like really separate systems.
Not if it's universal. I know in Australia, some of the best nurseries, for you to be able to get into the best nurseries, you have to have gone parenting class. My friend's just had a baby in Australia. She had to attend. It was a matter of course that they attended prenatal classes. I would say, is your mum alive? Is an auntie alive? I would say that's prenatal. I think again, our starting point is often a professional response to issues, when I think our starting point needs to be, who's the people that can help you do this, and should this early intervention, slightly off the topic, we're still recording, aren't we? No, that's fine, but is early intervention the right idea? Or is it having
a really healthy community out there that does what they do every day in lots of ways, and this happens all of the time, and a state system that responds to people who need particular sets of responses. And I think we've got more kids in care than ever before. We've got more kids with more social work caseloads that they say are unmanageable than ever before. How do we have, and I think there's enough money, how do we have a system that responds effectively to the needs of certain people and not run the risk, in this paper that we argue, that could swoop up a little bit more wider? And we know that in statutory social work, if you're poor, migrant, of BME background and so forth, you are overrepresented in some ways, in some of our particularly poverty. How do we have a more humane system?
But your premise there is that we have to have a healthy community
that is separate to the state structures, state systems, that we allow that to flourish. Another debate in my mind is, why do we have such a tight commissioning model to local government? Why are the NGO sector in this country, I think, we should probably turn the camera off in any minutes if I get misquoted in community care, but I am going to be well quoted in PSW. But there's something about a healthy advocacy model, and I think adults do this much better. I think the disability sector, mental health, I think there are very good advocacy models for adults that aren't connected or tied into commissioning with local government. When it comes to children, our service responses tend to be of a professionalised starting point. And in this situation, with families caught up in radicalisation concerns, we are suspicious of the third sector often. We are unsure about them. And I think that may well be further disservicing families having options to bring the people they want to bring to support them in really, really important meetings like child protection conferences. So I don't know, it's a complicated area, and it's a good debate, but there's a lovely new book, and I wish I could remember the title, but it's called something about From Early Intervention to Somewhere Else. And in the book, I will get the title and I'll send it to you, Kerry. The book, the author well argues this potential gateway of entering the system in a perceived helpful way to early intervene. And I just think what's helpful in everyday life and what the state responds to. And I like the distinction.
I can see that coming from an early health sort of background, that there is almost like a continuum. You start to, if you like, flip side of it being nurturing and helpful is that you're starting to gather evidence. And that evidence is passed on. So it can be.
And that's what we say in the paper. So the narratives of young children reported to be radicalisation risk, and their families largely seem to be the point of risky behaviour. That narrative travels. I was contacted by a human rights lawyer not long ago with a situation where a adult was in an adoption process somewhere in the country, and on their DBS was just a note that said possibly connected to a prescribed radical group. Now, that was a few years before. The adult had no idea that was even on, but it disrupted an adoption matter. Now, how do we get that right? So that actually information we record is the implications of that recording now are yet to follow through. And in this situation, it's quite emotive, and it's quite important we get the language right. I think
that goes back to what we said right at the very beginning, that 14, 15-year-old that gets the label of.
And our capacity to learn and develop and grow. So, for instance, there was an MP for Sheffield and Rotherham a few years ago, and he had some of his tweets from 10, 15 years ago. We were saying quite sexist and misogynistic things, and that were really very unacceptable. He'd said them 15 years ago, and he was a Labour MP, and I think he was let go. He was dismissed from his post. And I remember one commentator at the time saying that what he said was unacceptable, but the story that we're missing here is the story of someone who has, at one point, had these thoughts and had these beliefs, but has learnt and grown and developed and changed those views. And she was like, why aren't we having space for that conversation from someone to totally. And before we move just to the last question, the only thing I would say about involving charities, which I would be concerned about, is I'm concerned of the third sector filling a space that the state, my view would be that there is a role for the state, and I wouldn't want the state to roll back for charities. For me, it's an ethical issue. I think that there are services that the state should be providing, and that we shouldn't it shouldn't move to a position where we're relying on third sectors for those.
No, but I guess I'm arguing. I agree with you. And a civil society, the mark of a civil society is how we conduct a response to the most vulnerable. I think that's a test that most people will apply. But I do think in England we are, compared to other countries I know, I think there's less of a healthy agitation from third sector and community to hold the state accountable. And with such a commission model that local government commissions out certain services, and I hope it's as rigorous and research-led as it needs to be, but then they're in a relationship with the state to provide services, particular services that deal with particular issues. And I do like, I worked in HIV social work many years ago, and the healthy agitation of that community group led to all sorts of developments and advancements. And I'm not sure left alone the state would have done. So I do like the agitation, and I do think that there needs to be more agitation about how child welfare can be harmful. And I don't think families have enough support and advocacy that's available, because it's very difficult to speak out about social workers actually harming. And I'm not suggesting in these cases social workers set out to do anything other than to be helpful and ethical, but in the networks of professional dominance, I like the idea that families do have advocates who can help them and support them in our practice, because we are very powerful.
And I would totally endorse that and agree with you. And I think also historically, if you look at the changes within social work and different social work models of practice, if we think back to patch social work, the engagement that you would have with the voluntary and the NGO sector, faith organisations, it's very community leaders at a local level, engagement with families, pinpoints within the community. And I think the models that we've actually developed, the issues of specialism, centralised social work, or alternatively private models of social work in different ways, it's had a really detrimental impact. And I think also the codependency and the commissioning has been incredibly detrimental, because you've now got a situation where organisations who are going to be commissioned by statutory services have got to fit within a particular framework, and some of that is about maybe they are going to adopt a party line in order to ensure that they get a particular funding stream within a finite financial environment. So I totally
and as well. The notion of power here is really important for families and for us to understand.
What's the last question? So we've got one more question, and this one's from a bid.
What's a bid mean?
That's his name.
Oh, okay, sorry. I assume they looked at the relationship between children being looked after in areas of deprivation, perhaps social responsibility, radical social work challenge. But I think the word radical has almost been demonised, and radical social work is an incredibly important idea that helps us point out to the narratives that are dominant and subdominant, and notions of poverty and inequality and access, and social workers being able to agitate around families, particularly women, who are often easily blamed in our work around failing their children or staying with violent men as an often example. So I do think that. I think the word radical is really helpful. And again, I said earlier today, in some parts of Europe, there's a very clear distinction between radical extremist ideology and view and violent extremist behaviour. And in our legislation, those are collapsed ideas, which I think renders the social work task in this pre-crime space really complicated. And we do have to have really sound methods of practice that our leaders have confidence and our system is more confident, because I just think social work gets positioned really easily to go and do versus have our own way of understanding and therefore leading our practice.
I think for me as well, that notion that people change, fundamentally we are changing beings. I am not my 16-year-old self.
And I think it's
a good point.
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of, I think it moves back to, we're moving towards a culture now where it feels like we have to agree that there shouldn't be room for disagreement. I think when Theresa May went to a general election in June, she said it's because she wanted a bigger mandate to reduce the amount of debate in Parliament around Brexit. But I always thought that was terrible. I thought, what's the point of having? That's the point of having. We're supposed to have debate and discussion, and I think it's suddenly having this negative connotation that we can't disagree, that we all have to agree on everything.
I do. I really welcome the. I'm not sure who it was. I think it was Johnson, not Boris, the other one, about the place in universities to not be so managed and rigid about debates like views of transgender or the rights of some people to get up. We might not like what they say, but they must have a right to say it. And I think yes, exactly. Yeah,
they've got to explore.
Yeah, and in Birmingham, again, referencing Razia's work, there's some stunning work going on with schools using the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child to allow young kids to really see that they've got space to speak out. They're entitled to these things, and families and so forth. I think it's really exciting. We're getting a bit more nuanced and a bit more enabled around this whole debate. But I do worry, on large, that social workers and social work isn't offering research narratives, practice narratives enough. And maybe we're unable to do it because our workplaces won't encourage it. And I'm particularly lucky I've got the support of my workplace to do some work like this. But where is our practice body of evidence, really lived practice? And again, I'd welcome BASW's kind of support in that, because you've got thousands of members with rich practice experience that we could think about inviting in a way. You know, there are many social groups in the country grappling with these cases, and there are families being helped and there are families being harmed. And how do we really move into a much more confident, mature practice? And literally, there's a few of us in the country debating this publicly from a social work perspective. That can't be enough. And I'll close it there. So says Dr. Stanley.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I hope that was interesting. But it's nice that the paper's got a bit of debate going on and people are emailing in. So, oh God, you've been over there quoting. We clicked off. Are we clicked off now?